Okay, good morning. All right, well, I hope you're enjoying your Veterans Day assembly. I think your group doesn't get to enjoy it till a little bit later, but because of the compressed class times, I thought we'd go ahead and do this way. Okay, so what we're going to do is talk about public opinion and essentially how it dominates our political world, but we're going to dig pretty deep. So it's not just the macro level stuff, we're going to get into the micro level stuff. So the way in which this outline is going to work is we're going to start out like this and then kind of narrow things down. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about public opinion. Now, public opinion is really just a quantity of ideas, right, that permeates a particular group, right? It could be public opinion for the United States, it could be public opinion for the state of Ohio. It could be public opinion for Medina County. It really doesn't matter, okay? But we're talking about the quantity of opinions, right? And it could be opinions about all sorts of things. It could be free trade, gun control, abortion. It really doesn't matter, okay? So you can have public opinion about things at the macro level as well as the micro level. Now, admittedly, this is very difficult to do in a country with 324 million persons, and we're also the most diverse country in the world, okay? So you think about the two countries that are larger than we are, China and India by population. It's not to say they're not diverse, they very much are, all right? But our country is even more diverse. If you think about how many different kinds of people we have across our 324 million person group. Now, kinds of people, we'll talk about what that means here in a little bit, okay? But public opinion is generally grounded in values, our own values, and we'll talk about how those values play a role in generating public opinion. Okay, now, one of the questions that often pops up when you're discussing public opinion is whether that should drive public policy. That is to say, if you think about what our beliefs are, right, what our quantity of opinions are, is that what should be reflected in policy? Or even more specifically, is this what should be governed in our law, right? So whatever our majority opinion is, for instance, should that be reflective of our law? All right. Now, for the most part, that is true, right? That is the case, right? That public opinion is a reflection of our law, or vice versa, really. Our law is a reflection of public opinion. So you think about what our quantity of opinions are, the majority position on each one, that's a reflection of our law. Now, however, the framers of our Constitution were a little bit aware of this, and they made sure that they built a system whereby the majority just can't really tyrannize the minority. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the public agenda and just a couple of historical views. Now, getting back to the framers were absolutely elitist, all right? Now, they believed, of course, certainly by the way in which we would look at things today, very much elitist, in the sense that they didn't trust necessarily mass political involvement. Probably the best example of this, and continues to be, is the way in which we choose a president. Certainly we all go to the polls, we cast a ballot, but remember, we're actually casting a ballot for our state's electors based on political party affiliation. They all go to the Electoral College, and that's the group that actually selects the president. And of course, if you remember, although this has changed, the way in which the framers thought we should choose our senators, right? They were chosen really by the state legislatures. Again, they were not politically, they were not chosen through direct political involvement by citizens until just about 100 years ago. All right, so again, things had certainly changed, right? But regardless of the elitism, or regardless of how you think about that group, our framers being elitist, they just thought that policy should be free from public pressure. So again, they didn't really remove themselves from that question as to whether public opinion should be really rooted in our law. Should it be rooted in our public policy? Okay, now just a couple of contemporary issues to kind of warm us up, and there's just a couple I have in your outline. The first one is drug use and possession. Now, here public opinion has really changed quite a bit, right? And I could make the argument that it's at least changed twice significantly. All right, during the 1970s, the belief was that, well, we should decriminalize some forms of drug use and possession, and we did through the 1970s. Then in the 1980s, things got tougher. The penalties became more significant. Forms of possession and use at one time considered misdemeanors, maybe in the 1970s, became felonies, and very significant felonies in the 80s. And through the 90s, again, with 3 strikes and you're out, a lot of this was rooted in drug policy, in the sense that if you violate the law, depending upon what state you're in, be it a mix of felonies or misdemeanors, or only felonies or only misdemeanors, 3 strikes and you're out meant you'd spend the rest of your life in prison. All right. Then public opinion changed largely because we knew we weren't treating all criminal defendants the same. We also knew that we did not have enough room in our jails and prisons to handle it. So we've started to see a little bit in the way of decriminalization, right? And of course, to the point now where several states have legalized different forms and use of marijuana, despite the fact that public policy at the federal level, all right, federal law still criminalizes it. And we have this kind of like don't ask, don't tell approach to federal and state law, whereby, of course, as you know, pursuant to the Supremacy Clause, federal law is supposed to trump state law, but we're not quite following that very basic rule right now. Gun control and gun violence is another very, very interesting issue. Largely because of some of the high-profile shootings that we've had either at schools or other places of public accommodation, we've seen a real increase in public opinion, whereby that public opinion demands greater gun control. All right. However, it has not been reflective in our policy, okay? Now, some of this may be due to the fact that the National Rifle Association is a very strong lobby, and they've been at least powerful enough, successful enough, depending upon how you look at it, to limit any type of changes in gun law. So, greater support for gun control, no question about it. And some of this is event-based, and we're going to talk about events here in a little bit. But it's interesting. You have not seen a whole lot of change in gun control legislation. Okay, now, regardless of the fact that we have a very diverse population, right? 324 million Americans with different ideas. We have lots of different kinds of people, and we're going to talk about cleavages here in a minute, in the sense that we try to narrow the scope of people and their ideas, and we try to get to the lowest common denominator in regard to public opinion. But nonetheless, there are some things that we all believe in. All right, the first one of which, as you see on your outline, is personal liberty. Regardless of gender, race, religion, ethnic group, education level, age, right? All those cleavages we could possibly make. We Americans absolutely believe in personal liberty. So that is the ability to make our own choices. It's really kind of the foundation of our civil rights and civil liberties. Remember those freedom to and freedom from that we talked about several weeks ago. All right. Number 2, individualism. All right. The rights are personal. So yes, in regard to personal freedom, we have these rights, but these rights are individual. That I have the choice to say what I want, read what I want, write what I want, go where I want, contract for different services or employment or things of that nature that I want to do. All right, I can own property. All right. Now 3, and something certainly new, and we mentioned this several weeks ago, is equality. But we do believe in it. All right, maybe new. All right, maybe something that's maybe been birthed over the last 80, 90 years here in the United States. But we do believe in it. Now we believe in maybe different forms of equality, right? As we were talking about in regard to equal protection in the last chapter. But certainly we believe in at least some forms of equality, right? Even if it's nothing more than political equality, that there should be one person, one vote, everybody should be able to participate, everybody should be able to vote, etc. Okay, now, let's talk about the stability of our public opinion and our political beliefs, okay? Now, believe it or not, although, again, in the media, and we're going to talk about the media separately here in a little bit, the media will report change. Our political beliefs, for the most part, are pretty stable. All right, these are pretty stable beliefs, all right? Now, why? Well, you think about our political culture, right? And we'll define our political culture as really norms, customs, belief that exist over a period of time, right? They tend to be stable. A classic example of this, of course, is political party affiliation, right? One of the things to keep in mind is, as we go through this, that political party affiliation tends to be very, very stable. Now, that may be because we only have two political parties with a real chance at winning elections, but nonetheless, it is very, very stable. All right, so how do we get shifts? Well, we're going to look at some examples of shifts, and then we'll talk a little bit later as to why these things shift. Now, if you go way back in time, and again, we addressed this a little bit when we were looking at the Constitution for the first time, there was a lot of support for the British Crown among colonists for a long period of time, all right? And what changed, of course, were some of those tax laws that we talked about earlier, the Stamp Act, those types of things, whereby colonists were saying, now wait a minute, right? You're going to tax us, you're going to pass these statutes, but we don't have any say. All right, so you've all heard the phrase, and we talked about it a long time ago, taxation without representation. Well, let's say that were changed. Let's say the British Parliament all of a sudden said, okay, well, we will let you vote. Huh. Well, that might have actually changed things, and our evolutionary history might have been a little bit different. All right, another good example, it's kind of well documented, and I'm borrowing from Christopher Smith on some of this stuff. But during the 1950s and 1960s, in regard to free speech, be it communist, socialist, atheist, etc. A lot of this had kind of come to prominence in the 1920s, 1930s. People were jailed for what they were saying. And our country just kind of went through an evolution whereby, like, well, you know, people are just talking. They're just saying things. So they should have First Amendment protection, regardless of what it is that they say that makes our blood boil, right? Communists basically speaking out about the government's involvement in World War I, again, as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the end of that war here just this last weekend, and certainly yesterday. But nonetheless, these people were being jailed, they were being harassed, beaten, etc. And we kind of changed. McCarthyism, we came to see as really just too draconian starting in the 1950s. And we had kind of a second wave of this. And we changed our ideas. We thought everybody should have greater free speech. Interracial marriage is probably another good example. We were talking about this in regard to civil rights and civil liberties. Many states for a long period of time had laws that prohibited interracial marriage. And then on a state-by-state basis, states started changing their political culture, saying, you know what, the right thing to do would be to allow people of different races to marry, okay? To the point where you were just kind of left with a few, and by the 1967 Loving versus Virginia decision, the Supreme Court said that that was a violation of equal protection. It was a violation of equal protection to prohibit those of the same that prohibit those of different races to marry. Homosexuality is probably another good example, right, where our public opinion certainly changed over time. Again, us as a society becoming more open to different lifestyles, our alternative lifestyles, which used to be the phrase for a long period of time. And the Obergefell decision that was reached in 2015, whereby the Supreme Court said, yeah, you simply cannot prohibit the marriage of two persons who happen to be of the same gender. Now, regardless, and I kind of sped through these things, but in all four of those circumstances, change was gradual. Now, we'll talk about some events here where things can change very, very quickly, but change for the most part is gradual, all right? And the reason why is really cohort replacement, okay? One of the things we all know about the human condition is that we all die, all right? We live our lives and then we die, all right? But what happens when old persons die and new persons are born and they come into their own political being? Well, they bring with them new experiences, new understandings, etc. And although there are some influences that we'll talk about a little bit later, for the most part, there's going to be change, right? So younger persons have different, as they replace the older persons that die, they have different experiences, different ideas. So again, with changing demographics, right? Again, you will get changes in political opinion. Okay, now what leads to sudden changes? Probably the classic example would be wars, right? You think about World War II. Again, for the 20 years previous to the United States involvement, we believed that we should be an isolationist country. Let Europe deal with Europe's problems. And really, it wasn't until the attack in Pearl Harbor that we said, we just can't do that anymore. It was so draconian, it was so destructive, it was so awful. Almost overnight, our public opinion changed, and we knew we had to get involved militarily with American troops. Now, again, we had been involved in other ways, certainly, but we had not had a war declaration till that point. Okay. But nonetheless, wars are probably a pretty good example. Another one would be the Vietnam War. Again, our country taking a very strong anti-communist approach during the Cold War. And the Vietnam War, again, a little bit slower in terms of change than what you saw with World War II. We started to see things that made us doubt what the government was telling us about the Vietnam War, and that maybe some of this Cold War behavior might not have been worth it. Iraq is probably another good example, whether the United States should have been involved in Iraq following 9/11. At first, we were very excited to be in, excited in the sense that there was a lot of momentum. Nobody's excited to be at war. But nonetheless, we had this belief that we had to be there, right? And as soldiers were dying or became significantly injured, our opinion really did start to change pretty quickly. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the impact of popular culture. Now, we all like popular culture. We know one thing for sure. Pop culture changes, right? The question is really whether it changes public opinion. Does it change our public opinion about politics? Okay, and the answer is that it does, but we're not quite sure why, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce three theories here to look at this. The first is the catalyst for change theory, all right? And the idea is that public opinion actually changes pop culture, right? So what we think and believe actually is reflected in our magazines, our TV shows, what we read online, certainly today, what art looks like, what music looks like, things like that. So our opinion actually drives pop culture, right? Then there's the interactive theory. Well, public opinion changes pop culture, and pop culture changes public opinion. So the idea is they kind of interplay all the time. And I think if you were to ask analysts who are experts in public opinion, they would probably say that interactive theory is probably the best of these three theories that we're going to look at, but essentially that they intermingle a little bit. Okay, and then lastly, the barometer of public attitudes theory is the idea that, well, public opinion is nothing more than a reflection of pop culture, which is in turn a reflection of the way in which we think about things, right? But the barometer of public attitudes approach really does lead us to believe how easy change can occur, okay? Merely by asking people. And then when we ask people, well, that generates change itself, right? The classic example of this probably is the polling we do to determine whether, and again, this is borrowing from Christopher Smith's work as well, how we evaluate female leaders, right? Now, what we've seen is a constant change in the polls, right, whereby women are seen as better leaders, more equipped, right? Whereas for, many decades of this country's history, you just didn't see any female leaders, all right? But then we started to see leaders, right? And then we started seeing leaders, female leaders in television shows, media, right? Art, that type of thing. And then that changed our opinion over time, right? To the point where now we can measure certainly whether people think women would be better political leaders, and it's also, we're starting to see those greater numbers. So again, it's a lot of interplay. Again, popular opinion being reflective of pop culture, and again, us being able to study it merely by asking people, okay? Which again, we have the freedom to do. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is we have strong free speech rights, so we have the ability to ask people what it is that they want and they think, okay? And of course, that could change as well. Again, when you think about pop culture as really a barometer of what we see out there, think about how television shows, movies, etc., have endorsed gay or bisexual or lesbian actors, actresses, characters, etc. We've seen some significant change, certainly even in my lifetime. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about political ideology. Okay, now, what is political ideology? This gets back to consistency as well, just like public opinion. But it's something that really kind of forms a general philosophy. But the thing to keep in mind when it comes to political ideology is that political ideology is not simple. It's very, very complex, right? And we try to kind of compact it at the macro level. So we often say things when it comes to political philosophy. In general, this group believes this, right? In general, we Americans believe this. In general, African Americans living in inner city neighborhoods believe this. So it always starts off with like an in general, but that's to say it's not complex. It really does. When you dig deeper into these cleavages that we'll talk about here in a little bit, things become a little bit more complex. So the first thing I would want you to know is that, again, when it comes to political ideology, it is complex, and we try to compact it at the macro level. And the reason we do that is it makes it easy for us. Right? Think about it. That's the whole reason. We're going to spend more time talking about this when we get into political party affiliation. Party politics makes it easy. So we often say, in general, Democrats this, in general, Republicans this, but that doesn't mean all Democrats believe something and all Republicans believe something. Chances are that there are some significant differences within each party. So what we might do here is just look at some labels and some groups here. All right, liberals, conservatives, neoconservatives, and libertarians. And neoconservatives are, by the way, the group that I think are the most interesting to study. But liberals, so what can we say about liberals, all right? In general, liberals are those that believe in greater social welfare, greater equality, all right, greater involvement in government, that social and cultural change is a good thing, okay? And it's true, most liberals would identify with the Democratic Party, right? That's something we looked at many weeks ago. Now, that's not to say that all liberals belong to the Democratic Party, all liberals believe in social and cultural change and that it's a good thing, that there should always be equality across the board in every single way that you can imagine. But again, in general, trying to compact it at the macro level. Okay. 2, looking at conservatives. Conservatives are just generally the opposite. They like the status quo. They like traditional values. They don't think that social and cultural change is always a good thing. It's not to say they're completely opposed to it, but that's not, again, they generally don't think it's always a good thing. All right. Less government involvement, less of an emphasis on equality. The idea is you have a right to compete, and let's let the chips fall where they may. Social, cultural, and economic realities should be free from government intervention. All right. Okay. And then in general, right, as we like to say, conservatives tend to be members of the Republican Party. That's not to say, however, that all conservatives are members of the Republican Party. They may very well be Democrats. Now, one of the things, and again, we're just going to stop and take a little bit of a detour with just liberals and conservatives. It's not clear as to how these groups are being identified. Okay. Now, again, and this isn't a bad thing, but are we, as those who are analyzing it, we as political scientists saying these are the liberals and these are the conservatives, or are the liberals and conservatives self-identifying, right? That is, say, no, I'm a liberal and I believe in these things, as opposed to us saying you're liberal because you believe in these things. it makes it difficult, right? Now, again, one of the great things about living in this country, of course, is that we can study this stuff. We have strong First Amendment free speech rights, so we have a lot of authority to dig a little bit deeper into these things. But again, it is very, very difficult. Now, just as an example, will you find liberal Republicans? Absolutely. Will you find conservative Democrats? Absolutely. Will you find Republicans that are socially liberal? Right? Will you find Democrats that are socially conservative? Absolutely. Okay, so we try to compact things at the macro level, at the 35,000 foot level, if you will, just kind of borrowing from an air travel metaphor, I guess. Okay, now what about the neoconservatives? Okay, now when I was growing up, when I was in your seat, and I still like to study this group, this was kind of the big group. This was a group really of liberals who didn't break away during, let's say, the 1960s and the counterculture, right? So these were the liberals, if you will. Again, we call them neoconservatives. They were the liberals that said, okay, I can't go that far. I'm going to stay right where I am. Okay, that is to say, very anti-communist, right? But still believed in traditional liberal values, equality, social and cultural change being a good thing, government involvement, equality, things of that nature. So you can call them the old liberals, or maybe maybe centrists, if you will, maybe on a lot of issues. But neocons really kind of came into prominence in the 1960s, 1970s, and really through the 1980s. Best way to look at it, maybe liberal at home, but conservative abroad, if you will. But again, a fun group to study. Libertarians. All right. Now, libertarians believe in ultimate personal freedom, very little government involvement. All right. So these are groups that believe in less gun control, but also the ability to engage in drug use as they wish. Equality is not an issue, right? For them. Now, the question becomes, where do libertarians wind up in polls? Now, there is an American Libertarian Party. If you looked at this last election, you'll see that in some cases, libertarians polled, right around 1%, 2%, 3%. Some of the individual candidates did a little bit. If we had to push them in one category, either liberal or conservative, and this is what a lot of political analysts do, largely because we only have two viable political parties, at least in the sense that you have to be a member of the Democratic or Republican Party to be successful. We would generally put them into the conservative bloc. Many libertarians, knowing that there's an American Libertarian Party, will vote Republican, largely because they fear that their vote, quote unquote, would be lost, that it wouldn't count. And to a certain degree, there's a good understanding as to why they would believe that, or in the sense that if you vote Libertarian, your vote, you're just kind of throwing it away, and you're not in the mix of the two political parties that field candidates with a real chance to win. Okay, so again, it's not easy. Keep in mind, it's not always clear as to whether we're saying, okay, as analysts, you're a libertarian because you believe these things. You're a neoconservative because you believe these things. Or neoconservatives and libertarians are saying, no, this is what I am because I believe these things, right? And there's certainly a lot of back and forth, a lot of interesting back and forth. And again, we if you think about our political culture, our political ideology, there's a lot of power in labels, right? There's a lot of power in labels. And if you think about how easy it is to use labels, right? So if I say I'm a liberal, you know exactly what that means. If I say I'm a libertarian, it's like, oh, you must believe in these things. But knowing that's at the 35,000 foot macro level, there are some differences, right? You can't always bank on them. Okay, well, how do we get there? So how do we socialize ourselves? I mean, how do we get to the point where we start identifying ourselves as a liberal or a libertarian or a conservative or a neoconservative or a populist, something we didn't really talk about, except we did many, many weeks ago. The populists are the people that kind of are out there for the common person and kind of fear wealthy elites, and they certainly have a strong history. You could make an argument that President Trump is a populist in that respect. Okay, But what would we say about political socialization and how we got there? Excuse me. Okay, now, if you think about socialization, it's really the transmission of culture, right? So you've been socialized. Now, we get socialized in lots of different ways, right? We do it at school. We'll talk a little bit about that. We do it through our religion. All right, but what about political socialization? How do we get there? And this is the stuff that I find the most fascinating. Number one, because we get to look at how somebody becomes whatever it is that they're identifying themselves by label, or how we as analysts identify those people. That's one. But also, two, how people might break from these things. Okay, so how we get there, and then how we might even break from those things. And I find this kind of stuff very, very fascinating. Now, by the way, this kind of research, this kind of political analysis is certainly not new. This is something that political scientists actually borrowed from marketers and those who are experts in consumer behavior. You know, why does somebody living on the west side of Akron in a integrated neighborhood buy Tide detergent, right? So getting down narrowly. Okay, so how do we get there? Now, by the way, this is not a finite list. This is just a list that we can use to make things easier. Okay, number one is someone's family. Okay, we know a lot, and this is the stuff where I would really want you to get in your notes some of the details in those. Number one, we know from family that political party affiliation is pretty stable from generation to generation. So, in other words, if your parents are Democrats, you're likely to stay a Democrat. Okay, that's number one. Number two, political involvement. If your family was politically involved, you are likely to be politically involved. So, political involvement is stable, all right? Political party affiliation is incredibly stable, all right? If you think about, somebody's role in life, gender identification, gender roles tend to be stable over time. That does play some role in politics, but again, political party affiliation and activity, right? Awareness. If your family was, then certainly you are. Now, at what point somebody breaks from a political party affiliation within their family. So if my parents are Republicans, why am I a Democrat, or vice versa? Or why am I a libertarian if my parents were Democrats? That is much more complex, but it's generally due to some of these other things that we're going to look at here in a minute. Okay, school, all right? Public schools, private schools, etc., all right, have a heavy influence on political socialization. Okay, now this is, by the way, very much tiered to peers and communities. Obviously, the overwhelming majority of us go to public schools, and they're community based. You get that idea. Okay, now, as a rule, however, schools try to socialize young persons into the political process.